The sky changes color, the wind shifts direction, and in the seconds before the first drop falls, something happens in your yard that almost nobody has ever actually watched. Every bird disappears, not gradually, not one at a time. Within roughly 90 seconds of the barometric pressure starting to drop, your entire yard can empty completely. The feeder goes still, the branches go quiet. A space that was full of motion a few minutes ago looks abandoned. Most people assume the birds just flew somewhere else, found shelter in a neighbor's tree, waited it out somewhere vaguely nearby. The reality is far more specific than that, and far stranger. Birds do not just hide from rain. They predict it before it happens. They select shelter using criteria most people never think about. And what they do in the minutes during a storm reveals something about their physiology that very few backyard birders ever get told. Welcome to Bird Minds. Today we are going into exactly where your birds go when it rains, how they know to go there before the rain even starts, and what is actually happening inside their bodies while they wait it out completely out of sight. Stay until the end, because the last thing we cover is something that happens during the heaviest storms of the year, and it is the part that even experienced birders are often never told about. Birds know a storm is coming before you do, often by hours. This is not exaggeration. It is documented physiology. Birds have an inner ear structure that is exceptionally sensitive to barometric pressure, far more sensitive than human perception. As a low-pressure system approaches ahead of a storm, that pressure drop is detectable to birds well before any visible change in the sky. Researchers studying golden-winged warblers tracked a population that left their breeding territory abruptly, traveling more than 900 kilometers in advance of a severe tornado outbreak, departing a full day before the storm system arrived and before any meteorological instrument in the region had detected the approaching threat through standard forecasting methods. The birds left because they felt the pressure shift, not because they saw clouds. In your yard, this same sensitivity operates at a smaller scale every single day. You may notice unusual feeder activity hours before a storm rolls in, a sudden spike in visits, birds feeding with more urgency than normal. That is not coincidence. That is a population sensing a pressure change and responding the way any animal would respond to advance warning of a resource disruption. Eat now, because conditions are about to make eating difficult. Then, as the pressure continues to drop and the storm gets close, a second shift happens. The frantic feeding stops and the disappearing begins. So where do they actually go? The answer depends entirely on the species, and once you know what to look for, you can predict it almost perfectly for your own yard. Small songbirds, chickadees, titmice, wrens, sparrows move into the densest vegetation available, not just any cover, specifically cover with overhead structure that blocks direct rainfall while still allowing airflow underneath. A dense, evergreen shrub, the interior branches of a holly bush, the thick tangle near the base of a hedge. Researchers studying microhabitat selection during precipitation events found that small birds consistently choose locations with canopy coverage above 70%, dense enough to intercept most falling water, but not so enclosed that the bird cannot maintain visual awareness of its surroundings. This matters because a bird sheltering from rain has not stopped being vulnerable to predators. It has simply traded one risk for another. A Cooper's hawk does not stop hunting because it is raining. So the shelter a small bird chooses has to solve two problems simultaneously: staying dry and staying alive. Cavity nesting species have an advantage here that other birds do not. Chickadees, nuthatches, and woodpeckers can retreat into old nest holes, woodpecker cavities, or nest boxes where they are not just protected from rain, but fully enclosed against both weather and predators at once. If you have a nest box in your yard that goes unused during the breeding season, do not assume it is doing nothing the rest of the year. Cavity nesting birds frequently use old nest boxes purely as storm shelter long after breeding season has ended. Larger birds solve the problem differently. Crows and jays tend to move to the densest portion of the tallest available tree, positioning themselves close to the trunk where branches and canopy layers above them disperse the impact of falling rain before it reaches their feathers. Mourning doves, somewhat famously among birders, are not particularly good at finding ideal shelter and are frequently observed simply hunching on an exposed branch, feathers compressed, enduring moderate rain rather than relocating, a behavioral quirk researchers attribute to the species' generally lower investment in microhabitat selection compared to more cautious songbirds. Now here is what is actually happening physiologically while your birds wait out a storm. And this is the part most people never learn. Feathers are remarkably effective at repelling water under normal conditions. Birds produce oil from a gland near the base of their tail, the uropygial gland, and they spread this oil across their feathers during regular preening, creating a water-resistant coating that causes rain to bead and roll off rather than soak through. But that water resistance has limits. Under sustained heavy rain, water eventually penetrates the outer feather layer and begins reaching the insulating down feathers underneath. And once that happens, the bird faces a serious problem. Wet down feathers lose their insulating properties almost entirely. A bird that becomes thoroughly soaked in cold rain can lose body heat rapidly enough to become hypothermic within a relatively short window, which is why staying dry during a storm is not a matter of comfort, it is a matter of survival. This is why the posture you see in birds during rain is not random. A bird sheltering during a storm typically fluffs its feathers, traps a layer of air against its skin for insulation, and angles its body to present the smallest possible surface area to falling water. Researchers studying thermoregulation during precipitation events documented birds rotating their position relative to wind-driven rain specifically to keep the most vulnerable areas, the head, the underside of the wings, protected from direct exposure. Heart rate also changes. Birds sheltering during sustained storms show measurably reduced activity levels and lower metabolic output compared to normal daytime behavior, essentially conserving energy reserves during a period when foraging is impossible and energy expenditure needs to be minimized until conditions improve. The bird that disappeared from your feeder 20 minutes ago is, right now, somewhere in your yard, fluffed into a tight ball of feathers, angled against the wind, running its metabolism deliberately low, waiting. There is a specific danger that comes after the rain that almost nobody thinks about, and it explains a pattern many backyard birders have noticed without understanding why. When a storm finally passes, birds do not simply resume normal activity. There is frequently a delay, sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes longer, before feeder activity returns to pre-storm levels. Researchers studying post-storm bird behavior found this delay correlates with the time required for feather drying and thermoregulatory recovery. A bird that has spent an hour sheltering in cold, wet conditions needs time to restore its insulating air layer through preening before it can safely resume normal foraging activity, particularly in cooler temperatures. This is also the window when birds are at their most vulnerable. Wet, cold, and metabolically depleted from a storm, a bird emerging from shelter has reduced flight efficiency and slower reaction times. Predators that have also been sheltering know this. Hawks frequently resume hunting in the immediate aftermath of storms, specifically because prey species are emerging in a temporarily compromised state. If you have ever noticed a sudden, intense burst of activity at your feeder immediately following a storm, followed shortly by an alarm call and a complete vacancy, that is very likely what you witnessed. Birds returning to feed urgently because they are calorically depleted, followed immediately by a predator capitalizing on exactly that vulnerability. Now here is the part that even experienced birders are often surprised to learn. During the heaviest storms, the ones that bring sustained high winds in addition to rain, some species engage in a behavior researchers call storm roosting, where multiple individuals that would never normally share space cluster together in a single sheltered location purely for the duration of the weather event. Eastern bluebirds, normally aggressively territorial, have been documented packing into nest boxes in groups during severe storms despite showing no such tolerance for each other under normal conditions. Carolina wrens, house wrens, and even some species of warbler have been observed sheltering in unusually close proximity to other individuals, sometimes other species entirely. During the most severe weather events, behavior that disappears completely once conditions improve. Researchers interpret this as a temporary suspension of normal territorial and competitive behavior in favor of an overriding priority: surviving the storm. The calculation that governs every other interaction in a bird's daily life apparently gets set aside when the alternative is hypothermia. What this means is that during the worst weather your yard experiences each year, birds that have spent the rest of the season actively avoiding each other may be, for a few hours, sharing the exact same small space. A behavior invisible to you because it happens entirely out of sight, inside cavities and dense cover you cannot see into, lasting only as long as the storm itself. So here is what all of this means for the yard you thought you knew. The empty feeder during a storm is not absence. It is one of the most precisely coordinated survival operations happening anywhere in your immediate environment. Birds that detected the storm hours in advance selected shelter based on specific structural criteria, adjusted their posture and metabolism to conserve heat, and in some cases set aside deeply ingrained territorial behavior simply to get through the next few hours alive. None of it is visible from your window. All of it is happening anyway. The next time the sky darkens and your yard empties out in under 2 minutes, you will know what is actually happening in that silence. Not abandonment, not absence. A coordinated, physiologically precise response that has been refined over millions of years of birds simply trying to survive long enough to see the next morning. And when the rain finally stops and the first bird returns to the feeder, soaked and hungry and moving a little slower than usual, you will know exactly what it just went through to get there. Tell me in the comments, have you ever noticed your feeder go strangely active right before a storm hit, or completely empty out faster than you expected? I want to hear what you saw. I read every single one. I will see you in the next one.